It has been dubbed the largest missile and drone strike against Ukraine so far. On August 26, 2024, while still licking his wounds following the humiliation of the Kursk invasion, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered a concentrated missile and drone attack that struck several cities in Ukraine. ABC News called it a nightmare strike that targeted 15 regions in the country, with Russia launching at least 127 missiles and 109 drones during an 8-hour attack. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky labeled the attack dastardly, while pointing out that Russia was once again using its missiles and drones to hit civilian infrastructure. By the end of the strike, at least 7 people were dead and another 47 injured, with 4 of those 47 being children, according to Ukraine's state emergency service. Still, it could have all been so much worse. The reason it wasn't is that Ukraine was able to defend against this missile and drone attack, not only with the air defense systems it's used since the beginning of Putin's special military operation, but with a weapons platform that Zelensky has long said Ukraine needed. A weapons system that's capable of shooting cruise missiles out of the sky and over time may help to put Ukraine on a more even footing with Russia in the aerial battle. We're talking about the F-16. As well as being the day in which Russia launched its largest missile and drone strike against Ukraine, August 26th also marked the first time that Ukraine used F-16s to fight against Russia. In this video, we're going to provide a full analysis of how Ukraine used its new multi-role fighters, what its plans for the F-16s are likely to be in the future, and the challenges it still faces in establishing any form of aerial superiority over Russia. But first, a recap. Since the beginning of the war, Zelensky has argued that American-made F-16s could play a huge role in helping Ukraine turn the tide. The planes, he believed, would allow Ukraine to create small pockets of air superiority over Russia's enemy, particularly when used as part of combined ground operations, as Ukraine attempts to seize back territory Russia had snatched from it. But Zelensky was made to wait, and wait. In July 2023, several countries including Norway, Denmark, Belgium and the Netherlands formed a fighter jet coalition through which they pledged to deliver 85 F-16s to Ukraine. That might give you the impression that Ukraine received these fighter jets in 2023, but that wasn't the case. Before those planes could be sent to Ukraine, its pilots needed to undergo an extensive training program to learn how to use them. After all, these are pilots who have traditionally used older Soviet-era platforms, such as the MiG-29, and it would take them months to get up to speed on the F-16. The American multi-role fighter traditionally has a training program that lasts for 18 months. Even with that training being fast-tracked into a 6-month program, it would still be a long time after the coalition commitment was made before the F-16s would arrive in Ukraine. "It's been 18 months and the planes have not reached us," Zelensky proclaimed in July 2024, adding that he believed having F-16s would help Ukraine to unblock the skies over his country. The good news for Zelensky was that he wouldn't have to wait much longer to get his hands on F-16s. On August 4, 2024, Zelensky stood at an unnamed airbase in Ukraine, flanked by 2 of the first batch of 6 F-16s the country had received. "F-16s in Ukraine, we did it," he said during the ceremony, in which he thanked the coalition leaders who had made this possible while stressing that Ukraine would need many more. Those extra F-16s will come. It's believed Ukraine will have received 20 of them by the end of 2024, with another 65 waiting in the wings. But these first 6 will go some way to boosting Ukraine's air force so it can move away from the old Soviet systems upon which it's been forced to rely. Fast forward a little over 3 weeks and we arrive at August 26th and Russia's nightmare missile and drone attack. It was time for the F-16s to show what they could do. Sandbox News provided details about how Ukraine is using its F-16s in its August 27th report on Russia's missile and drone strike. It noted that of the 127 missiles and 109 drones that Russia sent to Ukraine, the vast majority were intercepted or shot down before they reached their targets. Ultimately, 102 Russian missiles were downed, along with 99 of the 109 drones. Ukrainian anti-air defenses were credited with the majority of these interceptions, but Sandbox claims that reports were coming in that Ukraine had deployed its F-16s for the first time, with those multi-role fighters taking part in a defensive effort that saw them shoot down several cruise missiles that were on their way to Kyiv and other locations. From there, the report became more speculative. Sandbox revealed that it wasn't known how many of its F-16s Ukraine had deployed in this defensive role, or exactly what types of missiles the planes had shot down. It notes that it's very unlikely that the F-16s were used to take out ballistic missiles, such as the Iskander-M, as their flight profiles make them difficult for the F-16 to counter. Instead, Sandbox says, it's much more likely that these F-16s played a part in taking down the bevy of surface and air-launched cruise missiles that Russia threw into Ukraine. It points to the Russian Kh-101 and K-59, both of which it says operates more like tactical aircraft than ballistic missiles when they're in the sky. These missiles are powered by jet engines, similar to those used in older jets, giving them a heat signature for the F-16's missile systems to track. Because of those jet engines, the missiles also fly at lower altitudes and take a more horizontal flight path than ballistic missiles. However, the fact that they top out at speeds of between 600 and 700 miles per hour means they have no real means of defending themselves against a fighter jet that can fly faster and track them via their engines. Add to this that Ukraine has already revealed that the F-16s they've been showing off were seemingly loaded with air-to-air munitions, such as AIM-120B missiles and Sidewinder missiles capable of using infrared targeting, and it's clear that Ukraine intended to use its new planes as air defense assets. That's precisely what it appears to have done during Russia's extensive missile and drone attack, with the F-16s being used to take out cruise missiles, while Ukraine's other ground-based anti-air defenses focused on the ballistic missiles and drones. Sandbox says it's most likely that Ukraine was using AIM-9M Sidewinders, which have a range of around 10 miles, meaning any plane firing them would have to get up close and personal with a target. Given that F-16s can fly at speeds of up to 1,345 miles per hour, as well as reaching cruising speeds of 577 miles per hour, it's very feasible that Ukraine used them to track, catch, and then obliterate these types of Russian cruise missiles Sandbox notes were used in the attack. It's even possible, though perhaps unlikely, that Ukraine took advantage of the M61 Vulcan 20mm rotary cannon built into the F-16. These 6-barrel cannons can rattle off an impressive 7,200 rounds per minute, with the caveat being that they're only really effective when the F-16 is within 2,000 feet of its target. They may have been used, though they would have required a pilot to get very close to a cruise missile, creating the risk of a debris cloud upon contact that could damage the F-16. Still, from all of this, we gain some insight into how Ukraine is using its F-16s. This initial batch, at least, appears to be a supplement to the country's aerial defenses. The F-16s weren't deployed on or behind the front lines and have yet to be used by Ukraine in combined efforts with ground-based soldiers. Instead, they're taking out missiles intended for targets on the ground in Ukraine, with their likely focus being to take out cruise missiles that Ukraine's ground-based anti-air systems can't track. A second missile and drone attack, launched just 2 days after the Nightmare attack, offered more insight. Sadly, it also showed just how much risk an F-16 pilot takes whenever they climb into the cockpit. According to a report by the Task and Purpose YouTube channel, Russia launched a second missile volley at Ukraine on August 29th. This one wasn't as large as the Nightmare attack, as it involved just 5 missiles and 74 drones fired at Ukrainian power generation facilities. However, Ukraine responded by sending an F-16 to take out as much as it could. That's when tragedy struck. The F-16 sent to take out the missiles and drones was piloted by Colonel Alexei Mess, who Politico says had long been a fervent advocate of delivering advanced fighter jets to Ukraine. On August 29th, Mess, who went by the handle Moonfish, was piloting one of those very jets during an aerial battle that saw him tackling the Russian missile and drone assault. He didn't make it. In a statement released by the Ukrainian Army General Staff, it was revealed that Moonfish had enjoyed some early success against the Russian missiles, shooting down 4 of them using his F-16's airborne weapons. Following that success, Moonfish, who was one of the first Ukrainian pilots to qualify to fly an F-16, encountered difficulties. During the approach to the next target, contact with one of the aircraft was lost. As it turned out later, the plane crashed. The pilot died, read the statement. Ukraine has yet to confirm if Moonfish was shot down or whether it was issues related to pilot or mechanical errors that led to his F-16 crashing. Whatever the case may be, the sad fact for Ukraine is that it's lost both a good pilot and one of the 6 F-16s it's received in the initial delivery, leaving it with just 5 until the next batch comes along. It was a difficult incident for the country, though it came tinged with a minor success. Moonfish had managed to destroy 3 attack missiles and 1 attack drone before his plane crashed. When combined with the much greater success achieved when dealing with the Nightmare strike that came 2 days prior, it's clear Ukraine is starting to figure out how to use its F-16s to turn the tide of battle against Russia. All of which brings us to a key question. What have we learned so far? Speaking to the Ward Carroll YouTube channel, Professor Justin Bronk, a senior research fellow with the Royal United Services Institute, says that these early engagements show Ukraine is taking a cautious early approach with its F-16s. So far, we're not seeing a huge amount of what the Ukrainians are doing with the F-16, which in many ways is quite encouraging. It suggests they're being fairly cautious with them. It suggests that they're probably concentrating on working out and practicing the dispersed operation model, said Bronk. This early caution is smart on Ukraine's part, as it means it's tempering the elation of finally having F-16s with the reality that it only had 6 of them as of the creation of this video. So it's deploying them in a limited defensive manner. There are no confirmed uses of the F-16 near the front lines, which Bronk points out is a far more dangerous use. They're also not being used to support the Kursk invasion, meaning Ukraine is either still working on the best strategy for a more offensive deployment, or it's biding its time until more of the promised 85 F-16s arrive in the country. Of course, these early engagements aren't risk-free, as we saw with Moonfish, but Ukraine choosing not to use its F-16s on the front lines right now means it believes the jets are best used in isolated engagements, which brings us to their current air defense role. Task and Purpose points out that the F-16 Ukraine lost wasn't flying near Kursk, and it wasn't lost near the borders where active fighting is taking place on the ground. This shows that the early assessments of their usage are correct, with Ukraine preferring to use its F-16s in an air defense role, meaning they will likely play the part of interceptors for the foreseeable future. Interestingly, the same channel also points out a side benefit of this interception strategy. Noting that there are only so many interceptor missiles to go around in Ukraine, Task and Purpose says that F-16s can more easily take out missiles and drones thanks to their advanced sensors, which frees up a lot of the older platforms to tackle riskier missions near the front lines. It sounds counterintuitive, but there's also a logic to this approach. Ukraine's pilots are far more experienced in flying Soviet-era jets that make up the majority of its air force. They know how to get the most out of them, says Task and Purpose, meaning Ukraine can use them to offer close air support to ground troops and conduct harassment missions, while the F-16 patrols the skies over Ukraine, ready to intercept any incoming missiles and drones. This approach also enables some level of training. After all, Ukraine's current F-16 pilots have only undergone around 6 months of training for a platform that usually requires 18 to master. By taking the more cautious approach of using F-16s as missile interceptors, Ukraine's pilots can cut their teeth on less dangerous targets, according to Task and Purpose. Perhaps the strategy is to gain greater familiarity with the platform in the short term, which will enable Ukraine's pilots to use F-16s in riskier frontline missions once the country has received more of its promised stock. That future looks brighter too, thanks to the F-16 opening up a whole new arsenal of weapons for Ukraine to use. Task and Purpose note that having Western jets at its disposal means that Ukraine now has access to the advanced weaponry developed by NATO that it previously was only able to jerry-rig into its Soviet-era jets. The channel points out that Ukraine's jets were forced to use R-60 infrared missiles and R-27 semi-active missiles during the early stages of the war, as those were all that were available, as well as being the only types of missiles the jets could use. Both missiles were developed in the 1980s, making them around 40 years out of date, and they resulted in Ukrainian pilots not having long-range capabilities. Compare that with Russian pilots who are using R-77 active radar missiles, and you see why this is so important. The R-77 has fire-and-forget capabilities, meaning the pilot can pull the trigger on the missile and then move away as the missile tracks its target. Ukraine's missiles required its pilots to keep the noses of their planes pointed at their targets, meaning they couldn't pull away to evade fire. That's all changed with the arrival of the F-16. The jet is capable of firing the AIM-120 AMRAAM missile, which offers both fire-and-forget and beyond visual range capabilities, with many calling it one of the best active radar missiles in the world. It has a range of over 20 miles and can move at supersonic speeds before delivering a blast fragmentation warhead to a target. With missiles like these, Ukraine doesn't just achieve parity with the weapon systems used in Russian jets, it exceeds them. As more F-16s arrive in Ukraine, it's likely that we will see more of the jets making their way to the front lines to more directly engage Russian jets in the skies. That could change the entire complexion of the war, as F-16s could tackle the planes Russia is using to launch glide bombs and take out targets on the ground to enable advances by Ukrainian soldiers. However, that type of strategy is likely being reserved for the future, when Ukraine is more capable of unleashing the full potential of its F-16s. For now, it's going down a more defensive route, which brings us back to Ukraine's current usage of the F-16 as an interceptor. It's been making the jet even more capable of carrying out its role by implementing new defensive systems. Task and Purpose examined the F-16s that were on display during Zelensky's August 4th announcement of their arrival and noticed that they had new pieces of kit installed beyond their missile systems. An examination of the jet's pylons revealed that some of them looked bulkier than they should, with one even looking like it had small vents and a camera lens installed. That's the combination of pylon-integrated dispensing systems and electronic combat integrated pylon systems, Task and Purpose said, adding that they are additional defensive models created to improve the F-16's survivability. With these systems, Ukraine's F-16s can use jammers capable of spoofing the radar signals enemy missiles produce, preventing them from locking onto their fighter jet while it's in the air. The systems are even powerful enough to confuse ground-based anti-air systems, as well as larger aircraft. Add an AAR-60 missile warning system to those pylons, which uses ultraviolet light to detect the exhaust plume an incoming missile produces, and you have extensive defensive capabilities. Those capabilities will prove essential as Ukraine continues to use F-16s in an interception capacity. They'll also prove vital should Ukraine ever send its F-16s into direct combat with Russian fighters on the front lines. By now we're getting a clearer picture of the Ukrainian strategy. It's using F-16s to intercept missiles and drones for now, all while preparing its pilots for a future in which it has more of those aerial platforms available, which may allow it to run more advanced operations closer to the front. Even if that future doesn't come to pass, the use of F-16s may free up Ukraine's Soviet-era aircraft to operate on the front lines in safe knowledge that the F-16s are protecting key Ukrainian military installations. And there's more. Returning to Justin Bronk's conversation with Wade Carroll, Bronk says that Ukraine has been attacking Russian air bases with large missile salvos already. By bringing F-16s into those strikes, Ukraine develops a greater chance for success, which will put more pressure on Russia to evacuate its air bases, relieving pressure on Ukraine in the process. Ukraine can potentially try and blend missile and HIMARS attacks to create this pressure, Bronk claims, which will result in Russia pulling more of its jets further back. Not only does this lower the risk of Russia sending glide bombs and its own jets into Ukraine, but it also creates space for Ukraine's F-16s to operate on the front lines with less risk of encountering Russian fighters. Even if Russia goes down the opposite path and creates layered defenses at its air bases near the front lines, Bronk claims, that will mean offering less defensive capacity to troops and installations that are actually on those front lines. Again, that would create opportunities for Ukraine's F-16s, allowing them to operate at lower risk as they'll face fewer defenses. This creates a win-win situation for Ukraine. Risk is lowered either because Russia is pulling back, which also helps Ukraine's ground troops, or it's lowered because Russia's frontline defenses are sent to its air bases, giving the F-16s more room to operate. Again, this is likely a strategy for the future. Ukraine will need to receive more than the number of F-16s promised to it to make this pressure tell. All of that brings us to the ultimate goal Ukraine wants to achieve with its F-16s, preventing Russia from gaining or retaining air superiority. As faltering as Russia's efforts to gain this superiority have been, given that it's lost 368 planes and 328 helicopters already, it's at least been able to rely on its aerial might from behind the front lines. Glide bombs are launched from bases Ukraine can't reach, for instance, allowing Russia to rain explosives down on Ukrainian targets with little recourse. Brock says the foreseeable future of Ukraine's F-16 strategy is not to gain air superiority, it's to prevent Russia from gaining air superiority. With Brock noting that even with its full fleet of F-16s, Ukraine will still be facing a Russia that has a fleet somewhere in the region of 350 genuinely modern and capable fast jets that are individually at a technical level significantly more capable than the F-16 in most metrics. So Ukraine's goal is to be capable of defending its skies rather than using its F-16s to operate with impunity over the front lines. That's an achievable goal that, if Ukraine realizes it, will relieve the pressure placed on its key military installations and troops on the ground. With his aerial options restricted, Putin will be forced to either waste more of his missiles and drones on strikes, cutting into his already dwindling supplies, or simply send more soldiers into a war that's already cost Russia over 630,000 military personnel. In the end, it's about imposing cost, argues Bronk. That's seen in the Kursk invasion and the long-range missile and drone strikes Ukraine has used against Russian energy facilities and its Black Sea fleet. Ukraine's new F-16s are likely going to become an extension of that strategy. They'll cost Russia valuable missiles, while helping Ukraine simply not lose the war long enough for its other strategies to really add up, to the point where Putin may have to pull out based on cost alone. Still, there's one thing that's being underestimated when it comes to Ukraine's use of the F-16. The impending arrival of the Saab 340 aircraft. In May 2024, Sweden announced that it would donate 2 of its Saab 340s to Ukraine, in a move that flew somewhat under the radar. With all the hubbub about Ukraine receiving F-16s, Task and Purpose suggests that the arrival of these planes could be a real force multiplier in terms of how Ukraine is able to leverage its F-16s. Why? Because it's a radar aircraft that's capable of spotting incoming threats before the F-16 systems can locate them. An F-16 without being backed up by this type of radar aircraft is like shooting a rifle without an ACOG or Advanced Combat Optical Gunsight scope, says the channel. The Saab 340 will serve as that scope. Though it's essentially a twin turboprop plane, the Saab 340 comes with a high-tech radar system and the ability to communicate the data it retrieves directly to an F-16 in the field. So the Saab 340 will track incoming missiles and similar threats at extremely far distances, allowing it to send tracking data to the F-16s so they can eliminate the threat. The arrival of the Saab 340 will reinforce Ukraine's use of the F-16 as an interceptor, making it far more effective than it currently is. And that, more than anything else, can make Ukraine's F-16 capable of turning the tide of the Ukraine war. With Saab 340s at their sides, Ukraine's F-16s become cruise and ballistic missile destroying machines, creating enormous costs for the Russian military while making their future missile strikes less effective. Perhaps that's why the Russian company Forez, likely under advice from Putin, is offering a 15 million ruble reward to the first soldier who manages to shoot down an F-16. That bounty, which amounts to about $170,000, is a sure sign that Putin needs Ukraine's F-16s out of the sky so he can continue his special military operation in the way he envisions it. Of course, there are still challenges ahead for Ukraine. The 6 F-16s it's received so far, or rather 5 now that one crashed, are far from enough to allow Ukraine to establish air superiority. They also aren't enough for Ukraine to fully realize its defensive strategy, meaning Ukraine can't start sending its Soviet-era fighters to the front lines yet. There's also the training issue to confront. 6 months of training has made Ukraine's pilots capable, but they're not at the stage where they can get the most out of the F-16 systems yet. Flying defensive missions, which are relatively low risk compared to frontline sorties, can boost flight hours, but there's still a clear skill gap that needs to be filled. It's also worth pointing out that Ukraine doesn't have access to the most modern weapons the F-16 can use. The US and NATO may not want to risk the most advanced weapons providing an intelligence coup for potential adversaries, claims Task and Purpose, while pointing out that Russia may be able to reverse engineer anything that it captures from crashed F-16s. There's still plenty of good news for Ukraine to take away from its first use of the F-16. It knows the jets are capable of shooting cruise missiles out of the sky, and that its pilots are well trained enough to make use of the planes. More flight hours will only build on this training, opening up further options in the future upon the arrival of the Saab 340s and the rest of the promised F-16 stock. And if Ukraine can maintain as many of its F-16s as possible, it's going to be able to use them to chip away at Russia's aerial and missile forces, as well as potentially offer support to its ground troops to drag Russia even deeper into a war of attrition that's already cost Putin and his military heavily. The F-16s aren't going to turn the tide of the war alone, but Ukraine's clever usage of them so far suggests that they'll become a vital piece of the Ukraine war puzzle, that when combined with Ukraine's other cost-creating strategies, will put and keep Putin on his back foot until he's forced to negotiate. What do you think about the arrival of the F-16s in Ukraine? Has Ukraine used them effectively so far, and do you think it will change up or build on its current strategies once more of these multi-role fighters arrive? Tell us your thoughts in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out The Ukrainian F-16s Are Strange, or click this other video instead.